An island turned into a burning inferno. American Marines, armed to the teeth with modern weapons, stormed Japanese fortifications day after day. The ratio of forces is 9-1 in favor of the attackers. The logic of war dictates that the defenders must surrender when the outcome of the battle becomes obvious. But this is not happening. Of the 5,000 Japanese soldiers, only 49 surrender. The rest are fighting to their last breath, turning every meter of the ground into a bloody mess. This is not an isolated case of fanaticism. This is a systemic phenomenon that has been repeated on all the islands of the Pacific Ocean, from Tarawa to Okinawa. Japanese soldiers demonstrated a level of self-sacrifice that seemed irrational, frightening, and incomprehensible to the Allies. Why each island had to be taken with incredible losses, and why the American command was seriously considering the possibility of using nuclear weapons to end the war, the alternative in the form of an invasion of Japan promised millions of victims on both sides. Today we will talk about this. Numbers that are scary. To understand the scale of the phenomenon, it is necessary to turn to specific figures that describe the reality of the Pacific War more eloquently than any words. The battle for Tarawa Atoll in November 1943 was one of the first significant examples. The Japanese garrison consisted of about 4,800 Marines and construction workers, who turned the tiny coral island into a powerful fortress. After 3 days of fierce fighting, when the Americans literally burned out every bunker with flamethrowers, only 17 Japanese surrendered. 17 out of almost 5,000. The rest died in their positions or committed suicide when resistance became impossible. This terrifying figure of less than 0.4% of survivors might seem like an anomaly if it wasn't repeated over and over again. On the island of Peleliu, the American forces had an overwhelming numerical superiority, 9-1. It would seem that such a balance of power should have led to mass surrender. But only 49 soldiers from the Japanese garrison surrendered. The battle, which was supposed to end in 4 days, stretched over 2.5 months of bloody battles in caves and jungles. Saipan has taught an even more terrible lesson. When it became obvious that the island was lost, something unprecedented happened. Of the 5,000 Japanese troops, 921 actually surrendered. At first glance, this may seem like a significant number. However, the rest chose collective suicide. Soldiers blew themselves up with grenades, and officers performed ritual harakiri. The fate of the civilian population was even worse. Thousands of Japanese civilians, believing the propaganda about the atrocities of the Americans, jumped from cliffs into the ocean, holding children in their arms. The statistics become especially ominous when compared with other fronts of the Second World War. On the Eastern Front, millions of German soldiers surrendered to the Red Army, despite Nazi propaganda and threats. On the Western Front, hundreds of thousands of Germans surrendered to the Allies. Even the Italian army, known for its low morale, surrendered in whole divisions. But the Japanese troops showed a completely different pattern of behavior. Interestingly, there was practically no category of wounded or missing in Japanese military statistics. The soldier either fought or died. The wounded, unable to continue fighting, often committed suicide or asked their comrades to kill them so as not to become a burden. This created a paradoxical situation. The logistical superiority of the Allies, their numerical superiority and air supremacy did not always guarantee a quick victory. Each island turned into a protracted meat grinder, where it was necessary to destroy the enemy physically, because psychological methods, demonstration of force, encirclement, blockade, did not work. Culture and propaganda. To understand such extreme behavior, it is necessary to immerse oneself in the cultural and ideological context of militaristic Japan in the 1930s and 40s. The phenomenon of Japanese military fanaticism did not arise out of thin air. It is rooted in the centuries-old traditions of samurai, transformed and perverted by modern totalitarian propaganda. It was based on the legendary Bushido Code, the way of the warrior. In its authentic form, it was an ethical system that emphasized honor, loyalty to the master, self-discipline and readiness for death. However, in the 1930s, Japanese militarists created a modernized, radicalized version of Bushido, adapted to the needs of a totalitarian state. This Bushido proclaimed absolute submission to the emperor, represented as a living deity, and argued that death for the emperor was the highest form of existence, the path to immortality. From the moment of conscription, Japanese soldiers were systematically taught that captivity was an unbearable disgrace, the worst possible outcome. The Senjinkan Military Code Manual for Military Personnel, issued in 1941, stated, "Do not bear the shame of captivity. Die so that you don't leave any dishonor behind." This was not a simple recommendation, it was an imperative directive, the violation of which meant betrayal not only of the army and the emperor, but also of the whole family. The captured soldier was officially considered dead, and his family was forever covered with indelible shame. Propaganda portrayed the Allies, especially the Americans, as barbarians and sadists who subjected prisoners to brutal torture, bullying, and humiliating deaths. The soldiers were shown fabricated photographs and told stories about enemy atrocities. This lie was so deeply rooted that many Japanese sincerely believed that surrender meant a painful death, so it was better to die in battle or commit suicide. The element of collective responsibility was also added. Japanese society is traditionally collectivist, where the individual exists primarily as part of a group, family, village, nation. The soldier was taught that his actions reflected on his entire family, on his ancestors and descendants. Surrender meant not only personal disgrace, but also eternal damnation for the whole family. Interestingly, the officer corps demonstrated an even greater degree of fanaticism. Japanese officers, brought up in the traditions of military academies, where elitism and special devotion to the emperor were cultivated, considered it unthinkable to survive defeat. Many commanders destroyed codebooks and maps, and then committed ritual suicide, seppuku, which was considered a worthy ending for a samurai. How did the Japanese fight to the end? The military tactics of the Japanese forces at the final stage of the Pacific Campaign were a bizarre mixture of ancient traditions and modern military science, viewed through the prism of doom. As the strategic initiative passed to the Allies, the Japanese command developed more and more sophisticated defense methods designed to maximize enemy losses even at the cost of completely destroying its own troops. Defensive tactics were based on the creation of a deeply entrenched system of fortifications. The Japanese masterfully used the island's terrain features, caves, hills, and coral reefs, to create virtually impregnable positions. On Iwo Jima, for example, they dug more than 20 kilometers of tunnels, creating an underground city where the garrison could live and fight for weeks, despite massive bombing. Artillery and machine gun nests were positioned in such a way that they provided crossfire, and underground passages made it possible to quickly transfer forces and counterattack the enemy from unexpected directions. Each bunker, each firing point turned into an individual fortress, which had to be stormed. The American Marines have developed special tactics, suppressing the firing point with artillery and aircraft, an approach supported by tanks, throwing grenades and, finally, destroying the defenders with flamethrowers. But even after that, the Japanese soldiers, wounded and burned, could continue to shoot with their last strength. The night attacks, the desperate massive offensives with cold weapons, were particularly terrifying. When it became clear that the position was lost and the defense was meaningless, the Japanese gathered all their remaining forces, from combat-ready soldiers to the wounded, who could barely stand on their feet, and rushed into a final attack shouting "Long live the Emperor." They walked at full height, with rifles, swords, knives, sometimes just with sharpened sticks and grenades. These attacks rarely achieved tactical goals, but they created mental pressure on the Americans. Some Japanese soldiers did surrender, but this usually happened under special circumstances, severe injuries, complete lack of ammunition, or when a person was physically unable to continue resisting. Interestingly, there were disproportionately many Okinawans and Korean workers among the prisoners who were forcibly mobilized by the Japanese. These people were not imbued with militaristic ideology and did not experience the fanatical devotion to the emperor that was characteristic of ethnic Japanese from the main islands. The tragedy of senseless victims. By the end of the war, the situation had become even more absurd. When the outcome of the war was already a foregone conclusion, when Japanese cities were reduced to ashes by American bombers, soldiers on remote islands continued to fight, unaware of the surrender or unwilling to believe in it. Some Japanese soldiers hid in the jungle for decades after the end of the war, continuing to wage a guerrilla war against a non-existent enemy. This tragedy of mass self-sacrifice has left a deep mark on history. On the one hand, it is impossible not to recognize the incredible courage of individual soldiers who are ready to die for their beliefs. On the other hand, this fanaticism led to the senseless deaths of hundreds of thousands of people who could have returned to a peaceful life. Japanese society is still going through this trauma, trying to find a balance between remembering the victims of the war and condemning the militaristic ideology that led to the disaster. Friends, what do you think about this? Subscribe to the channel, put likes and write comments. See you soon.